Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of Pastoral Dialogues. On behalf of Kalpavrik Center for Pastoralism and Indian Commoner, I welcome you all to this series, which is a curated set of conversations on pastoralism in India. I will begin by giving a brief introduction about us. So, the Center for Pastoralism undertakes research aimed at understanding pastoral ecosystems. It develops collaborative programs to enhance livelihood securities of pastoral groups and also has outreach activities to educate the wider society about contribution to pastoralism. Kalpavriksha is a non-profit organization working on environmental and social issues with the belief that a country can develop meaningfully only when ecological sustainability and social equity can be guaranteed. And the Indian Commoner is a forum set up to discuss the current state of common pool resources in India and other parts of the world. So the idea behind these dialogues was a shared belief that although pastoralism as a livelihood contributes to India's food security, biodiversity conservation, and even arts and crafts and provides sustenance to almost 30 to 35 million people, these narratives are still very invisible and therefore are left out in policy spaces and ignored by society at large. We, therefore, wanted to create this series as a space for conversations around pastoralism that could be accessed by anyone who wants to understand a little bit about this intriguing space. So today's format is a little different, and we wanted to mix it up and see how it goes. And we have two wonderful speakers with us today, Dr. Purnendu Kavoori and Dr. Matthieu. And both of them are here, and it's good to see their faces. So a little bit about them. Dr. Purnendu has researched on pastoralism and pastoral society for well over 3 decades. And I've also had the wonderful opportunity to be taught by him because he is taught at IDS Jaipur and Azim Premji University in Bangalore. He is presently the senior advisor to the Foundation of Ecological Security and Director of Center for Social Ecology in Jaipur. Dr. Matthieu has worked in Western Cameroon and amongst pastoralists in Gujarat. His work aims at understanding transformations in pastoral livelihoods and emerging human-environment relations. He is currently based at the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development. And with this, I welcome all of you to this wonderful conversation. And if there are few uh, requests that I would have from you, please keep your videos off so that we can look at the speakers and keep yourself muted. And we would also request you to, we'll keep all the questions for the last towards the end of the conversations once both of them have had the session ended. So for all your question answers, please write it on your chat box and we will try to answer it towards the end at once. So without further ado, I would want to start. So this is a recording, which is the format we are trying, and hopefully you would like it. Ria, if you could just share.
So we are going to start this pastoral dialogue with Purnendu Kavoori. Purnendu, would you tell us how did you start working with pastoral communities in India?
Thanks, Matthieu. It's a soft question, but an entertaining one. You know, my life has been something of an academic nomad myself. Because I started my career, my academic career as a student of archaeology and ancient history. And I was, for my MPhil dissertation, I worked on what is called the pre-Harappan cultures in Balochistan, northern Balochistan. And that is where I first developed an interest in pastoralism. I studied the evidence for migration, pastoral movements through pottery, through bones of animals, but roughly in the second millennium BC. So I ended up leading a lot of ethnographic material as a result. And sort of Western Asia focused by and large, but it made me, that was the initial trigger. And I developed an interest in pastoralism at that time. I also developed an interest in ecology at that time. I was studying the Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is supposedly a hotbed of Marxists and leftist thinking. But interestingly, I was not a member of any leftist group at that time. I was, in fact, a member of a group that was called Free Thinkers. So, if anything, the influence of Marxism, to the extent that it has an influence, all happened with me after I left JNU, not when I was in JNU. And that's how I started. And then after I finished, I decided to try and get a job in Rajasthan and seriously engage and study pastoralists, nomadic groups in contemporary contexts rather than 2,000 years ago. Well, not 2,000 actually, 4,000 years ago. Well, Matthieu, now that I have given you my own idiosyncratic entry into this world of pastoralism, you know, all of us come to a field from particular backgrounds, life histories, cultural experiences. And it would be nice to know as to how did you end up in the same place as I have ended up in?
Yeah, in Western India. Well, you know, I started by studying anthropology, and because the thing that got me really interested in this field was that it was providing means to understand how people think, how people see life, and to get a grasp on the logics of different societies. and how it works actually. So I first got engaged with the field when going to Cameroon in Central Africa, Western Cameroon. And I was working with sedentary agriculturalist farmers organized in small kingdoms and so on. And the thing is that the relation with animals was kind of very neatly separated. You had the wild with wild animals and so on, and then the village. And after that, I got a research contract to go to India, but I knew nothing about pastoral people in India, and let's say in general, not much. So I arrived in Gujarat working with archaeologists who were interested in getting a grasp at how contemporary pastoralists were living and managing in semi-arid areas. And let's say it was a kind of a shock, like to see people living in the open, moving every day and managing to live on a on a daily basis. And I think maybe the thing that interested me really a lot was that people and animals were living together. It was like with the lives totally integrated, mingled together, and how people manage to adapt really to changing condition every day. They stay in one place and then they will move to another one and so on. So that's how I got to work with pastoralist people, and then I never stopped.
Thanks. That's interesting. Both of us have come in different ways, and good to enter into a conversation. Yeah. Thanks.
You're right. And so what were the main lines or the main questions that you've been interested in when you discovered the pastoral way of life?
That time, it was a very different kind of academic milieu. The field of development studies was largely populated by economists and economists of a neoclassical bent of mind. So much of the research was done within the framework of what we today call modernization theory. Ecology really had not made much of an intellectual presence, at least not in the backwaters of Jaipur. And to that extent, I had to start to learn asking questions, because the kinds of questions that I was encouraged to ask from my environment were not particularly rewarding. Cost-benefit analysis of shepherds, how much they sell, how much they buy. This doesn't really tell you much about what pastoralism is about. Again, the trope of what we call sedentarization was also dominant at that particular time. I remember a senior colleague of mine, an economist, informing me that my research was actually a waste of government money and that pastoralism would soon end and the Indira Gandhi Canal would transform the countryside. So these things limited you intellectually in asking questions creatively. So a lot of my struggle was in trying to find a vocabulary which allowed me to ask questions that were rewarding. And it took me a long time. Initially, pastoralism was given a certain amount of space on grounds as a relic of a system that had to be documented before it disappears. And anthropology contributed to that. However, when I began my fieldwork in 1987 or so, and I found out I was a young man of around 27 at that time. I traveled with a group of shepherds in Jaisalmer, a very large group of shepherds, around 50 odd men, some 5,000 odd sheep. And I walked with them all the way to Haryana and back for a whole year. all that idea that this is a residual way of life, that this is a relic that has to be documented, all that started coming apart, because I could see how closely and how deeply they were integrated with contemporary economies. These were not historical pastoralists, they were contemporary pastoralists. So that was a very crucial transition I believe I made, in recognizing that you are not dealing with something that is past, you're dealing something that is present. The idea that pastoralism and what mainstream called modernity were in some ways in a relationship of mutuality, that recognition was necessary for me before I could start asking questions that were more meaningful and useful. So my struggle was at one level that of doing fieldwork, that of finding ways. It is always challenging doing on fieldwork, with pastoralists. But that was only part of the struggle. And it took me many years to find a vocabulary and a way of conceptualizing the relationship between pastoralism and the contemporary world we live in outside the framework of modernization theory.
Okay, thank you. So, what I know about pastoralist systems is that there have been a lot of literature putting the emphasis on the fact that ecological conditions play a key role, and it has been called a kind of ecological determinism to talk about pastoral systems. But now, I mean, for like the last 20 years, we know that so many factors come in and play a key role, and particularly the political aspect and the institutional dimension with the common pastures, with sets of rights of access to areas, to migrating areas, and so on. What would you say about that, about the evolution of the political framework regulating access to migrating zone and pastures?
I think we can respond to that question in two steps. One is to look at the relationship that ecological ideas have had in our understanding of pastoralism. Some of you will remember that there was a conference in Nairobi in 1980s. It was a conference on desertification. In that conference, pastoralists and pastoralism were squarely blamed for ecological crisis, ecological deterioration. And to a large extent, that view tended to dominate. So on the one hand, you had the colonial legacy of viewing pastoralism as anti-state, as in some ways, if not criminal, then at least on the borders of criminality. And even as that particular kind of way of looking at pastoralism tended to gradually become emptied, this discourse on pastoralism as environmentally destructive started taking over. And this continued till the 80s, early 90s, in fact. And it took a lot of field research to begin to show, and not just in India, especially in parts of Northern Africa, even Western Asia, that pastoralism, in fact, had a much more complex relationship with the ecosystem, with the biophysical and social environment. And that transition is a shift that I have lived through my work. The generation that is coming in and working on pastoralism now is beginning its work after that transition has taken place. Whereas when we were going through that transition, it was almost as if there was a struggle for contesting And in some ways, you might say, making a case for pastoralism as something which has a rationality, which cannot be grasped purely in the language of economics and cost-benefit analysis. And ecology played a very crucial role in providing that vocabulary, in providing that conceptual framework. It had its plus points, the growth of ecology as a framework. One plus point was that, you have the language of science at your disposal. You can say it is scientific. When you have the language of science at your disposal, it is a very powerful instrument. But it is also very limiting, because it stopped other kinds of conversations around pastoralism from emerging. So the next phase that you talk about, when you talk of institutions, you talk of relationships, what you might call reciprocities, accommodations between pastoralists and other communities. This is something that again comes and enriches what I would call the ecological perspective. It is very interesting because in the 1940s and 50s in the US, there was a framework called cultural ecology, which was widely influential, and then it became discredited, seriously discredited. After that, you had the emergence of what you might call ecology in the more strict sense, making its way as an explanation within social sciences and especially in pastoralism. And then again, we mark a return. Now the language is that of social ecology. You don't say cultural ecology. But again, a similar kind of vocabulary starts making its way. So the argument becomes more complex.
With no, okay, I have it. So when you look at pastoral systems and the way they relate to the environment and to components of landscapes, to animals in the landscape, but also in their flocks, you see that there are very multiple ways to think about these components of the world and of the environment. So nowadays, there is a kind of change in the ways to think about pastoral systems, and with what we call multi-species ethnography and so on. And it also brought some very interesting insights about the idea of domestication, and finally, how these pastoral systems appeared in the history of humanity and how they work actually. Would you like?
I think I can maybe respond with some specific descriptions about how I've seen these things actually operate.
Yeah.
My stamping ground is largely Western Rajasthan, so I will tend to give my stories from Western Rajasthan. But they say, I was told that in the pre-colonial and even in colonial times, much of Rajasthan was under the rule of the Thikanas, that is the feudatory rulers. And when there was lands that were unoccupied or had not been occupied by people, and they wanted to settle new people into something, the Thakur would first introduce pastoralists into an area. That is Raikas or Rebaris. They would be the first people to be asked to go and settle an area. They would stay there for a fairly long time, maybe 5 years, 7 years or so. And their presence apparently would have a consequence or impact on the landscape. It would change it, the droppings of the animals, the grazing systems. So you started getting a more stable landscape as a result of their interventions, to a point then where almost in the nature of a succession could be seen taking place. And rain-fed agricultural groups would start coming and colonizing that place. So the pastoralists laid the ground for that. And then that period would go on, and then maybe some specialized agricultural groups would also come there. Eventually, you could end up with service groups, specialist groups. So you saw a whole pattern in which pastoralists do play a pioneering role in the making of landscapes, and they continue. It's not as if they disappear, but their relationship becomes interstitial with the landscape. They migrate, they come out, they are seasonally using landscapes, and so on. So the fact that pastoralism, you see, when we think of pastoralism, we think of mobility, we think of migration, dramatic migrations, from in Western Asia or in Africa, or even in India, very large-scale migrations. But we don't really seem to pay attention to the ways in which their presence, their movements, the way they shape the land. Now, this thing became very clear to me in a study that I did in the early 2000s. There is a river in western Rajasthan. It's called the Luni River, which means saline. This river is a semi-perennial river. For a few months, it flows at the most. And for the last 20 odd years, when I did my study, it had never flowed. Now, it was a river that was known to flood dangerously. It was also known to be dry in many years. But for such a long period, it never having run was unusual. Now, you looked at the rainfall data, I realized something very interesting, which is that the development imagination that looked at this river saw the river by default in terms as an agrarian river, as a river where agriculture is what it supports. The fact of the matter was that the Luni is not an agricultural river. It is in fact a pastoral river. It is a river that is sustained by pastoralism. Now, the pattern of utilization was this, that through the tract that this river runs, it's semi-arid and arid. On either banks of the river is a very small stretch of agricultural land. There are shallow open wells which are recharged by the flow of the river and which allow a crop to be taken, maybe wheat or gram. Beyond that, you would have a substantial tract which was rain-fed, which would grow millets. And beyond that, you would have what we can call grazing country or pastoral country. Now, what happened was that development intervention did some very dramatic changes in this landscape. First of all, you have something called tube wells. As tube wells emerged and came in the region, agriculture expanded, the entire landscape was transformed. From being a single crop area, it became a double crop area. Tractors allowed agriculture to get into the pastoral stretches also and converted that into single crops areas. That entire landscape over a period of 25 years was transferred from an agro-pastoral, primarily pastoral landscape into one that wanted to saw itself as an agricultural landscape. Its effect was that the entire drainage system stopped flowing. Water stopped coming to the river. This area is saline, so those wells dried up. Those tube well irrigated landscapes ceased to produce crops. Salinity started rising in the single crop areas, those collapsed. And the pastoral areas were destroyed by plowing through tractors. So you had this whole landscape that had been shaped by pastoralism as a, you might even call it a keystone species, in this whole structure. And that is removed because you didn't understand the system. You had some preconceptions about what river systems are like, what landscapes are like. And as a result, you end up with a landscape that is neither productive pastorally, it is no longer productive agriculturally, it is in many ways a abandoned and severely deteriorated landscape. It's, I think, important to understand pastoralism outside the limitations of our standard framing of pastoralism as groups of nomad, as peoples walking long distances, as migrating. And that is important. That is also very important. But it is not just that. Pastoralism can be seen as a gradient in two dimensions. One is in terms of its mobility. There are people who move long distances. There are people who move short distances. But pastoralism is never sedentary. It is always moving. Some degree of dynamic movement is there. And the second important thing about pastoralism is that people move in and out of pastoralism. It is not a static system.
Yeah.
At the very top, pastoralists might move out of pastoralism. At the very bottom, they might again move out. So the thing is, a very poor person can become a shepherd and have 10 animals and start moving and moving up. So when somebody asks me, who are the pastoralists of Western Rajasthan? I say, everybody is a pastoralist in some degree or other. Everybody keeps animals, everybody moves, and that movement, that distribution of risks over multiple landscapes, over different ecosystems is integral to it. And when we say everybody is a pastoralist, there is another important claim we are making. We are trying to get out of the ethnicizing of pastoralism. You know, pastoralists have been more or less confined now to the pages of National Geographic in our imagination. Exotic creatures. I sort of want to get out of that. There is pastoralism, there is an everydayness to pastoralism also. And normalizing doesn't mean mainstreaming, but understanding that our own concepts of mainstream are very limiting and they do injustice to the relationship that pastoralists have had historically with their landscapes and the relationships they have had with other communities in their mutual evolution and development.
Yeah. So there are some works being developed now about, and they see pastoralists as experts in variability and in adapting or responding to variability. And it's quite interesting because they show that basically when you have pastoral systems, it's so flexible and you have a set of social mechanisms that allow to adapt to any kind of change in the environment, be it the natural environment or social, socio-political, economical environment. No. So, and there is clearly, I think, some lessons that can be learned from pastoral communities in the ways to deal with changing environments, particularly nowadays as we talk about climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on, and increasing instability in the world.
There is a danger in a conversation like ours of becoming a little too academic. But yeah, I think the question you raise is important in the sense that we are moving into times where unpredictability is the new norm. Nobody anticipated our present crisis. And pastoralism as a system of production is woven around. It doesn't try to manage unpredictability. It tries to work with unpredictability. And it does this by becoming an extremely dynamic system. Very simple examples. Take something like species composition. You know, every species has a different rate of growth. Every species has a different kind of resource requirement. Pastoralists often have multi-species strategies in which after a drought, let's say, they will have a small herd of small ruminants, which can rapidly grow. After a period of time of stability, they might change to other kinds of animals, which require more stable environments, you know. So in simple things like playing with, you know, how stock shareholders do it, they play with stocks. Do you have some stocks which are stable. They're doing something like that. The other thing is mobility. All of us are so completely have internalized stability as
sedentary people,
sedentary, that we don't realize that movement is also normal. This was taught to me by a shepherd friend of mine. This is that Luni River study. Every day we had a camel and a camel cart, and for about 4 months we were moving together. Every day we would have to park in some place which we didn't know what it was. And I would be very anxious. Okay, will we find a place? Jagah milegi? Will we get water? Will the people be comfortable? Will it not be unsafe? And this continued for a month. Then Premji, my friend and guide, he told me, tension mat karo. Don't get tense about it. Anjal ki baat hai. It will happen. It will take place. And in the 4 months, we had only one unpleasant encounter. So in a sense, he melted into the landscape. After a certain time, I also melted into the landscape. I stopped feeling that I was a man with a camera doing field work. I sort of melted into it. People would ask you, what is this dero hai? Let you go. And I believe that we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn in accepting and understanding and respecting that mobility in itself is something that we have become so alienated from that we exoticize it. It is something that we need to perhaps rethink and be more comfortable with. There is a history to this, as is obvious. It finds its roots in colonialism, but then everything can be blamed on colonialism, perhaps. But if you look at pre-colonial states in India, they are much more comfortable with mobility. The Jaipur ruler, when animals would migrate into Madhya Pradesh, would send emissaries to inform them that our people are coming with a Praman Patra and engage with states. Colonialism, the colonial British rule sought very consciously to limit mobility, to sedentarize people, to find ways of incorporating them in our, what we call the commodity economy. This did not change with the independence. The vocabulary changed. It was no longer the vocabulary of criminality and vagrancy. Now it is the vocabulary of primitiveness. If not primitiveness, then backwardness and mainstreaming and developing people. But the effect was basically the same. Modernization, it's very, very vulgar to go on criticizing Nehru for everything. But one of the first in Rajasthan, he inaugurated a village for sedentarizing Gadolia lohars, for example, from what I have heard. So sedentarizing was ingrained in the development imagination. I believe that from 2000s onwards, we have seen a considerable shift in this thinking. And I believe it marks a radical departure. I a welcome one.
It's often talked about when we are dealing with pastoralist communities is the specific institutions that have been set up regarding the access to grazing areas and so on. And this is all that we call the commons and common pasture areas and so on. It seems that in India there have been a lot of changes regarding the commons through privatization, land use change, and so on. What would you say about contemporary dynamics about commons in India?
It is very unlikely that there can be a viable pastoralism without some degree of common pool and common access to pasture and grazing. Which is not to say that it is only on commons that pastoralists base their production. In fact, I think there is also some broadening required on how we conceive of commons. There are commons which are permanent, well-defined, but there are also commons which are transient and open-ended. So this is not just in India. If you go back to other parts of the world, if you go back to medieval European history also, you find that there are rules and regulations when flocks can enter fields, when flocks can enter into certain areas which they would otherwise not have been entering. And this dynamic character is, I think, what brings the cultures of commoning and pastoralism together. You can't have a political culture like you have in, say, USA, where a person has the right to shoot somebody who enters their field. In India, at least in northern India, which I'm familiar, and western India that I'm familiar, well, even other parts of India, notions of the private and the shared are not that clear, not that clear cut. There are thresholds, there are gradients which are dynamic, which change. And this is part of a culture that has evolved over a period of time. We perhaps tend to underrate the extent to which these cultures of accommodating and practices of mutuality continue to operate in India's agrarian social economy. Having said that, however, one should acknowledge that there has been a dramatic shift in the extent to which these traditions, cultures, and practices are prevalent and they obtain now. Perhaps pastoralists find novel ways of negotiating, but sometimes the nature of the structural changes that have taken place are too overwhelming. This is especially so when they encounter governments and states. Grazing in forests, for example, is a fairly regular source of strife between pastoralists and rangers. So this is a matter of engaging with people, being part of a larger dialogue. As we said elsewhere, I think earlier somewhere we mentioned that a Forest Rights Act is something that has evolved over a period of time and views have changed on this. I believe that there is potential for changing views and deepening our understanding.
So this relates to the question of what would be the space that is left for pastoralists in the contemporary state, actually, if you look at the political side and the institution and the framework. For example, when you look at commons, we have the category of wasteland that is widely used to classify some areas that are actually used to graze the animals of pastoralists, so which are savanna kind of, and which have high value for pastoralists, but still are categorized as a wasteland, and so can be the destination of this land can be changed.
A lot of implications. See, there are two questions that you have asked. One is, what is the place of pastoralists in the modern state, political space? The interesting thing about pastoralists is, at least in South Asia, is they are neither the poorest of the poorest nor the most powerful. They are not the most privileged of people, but nor are they people at the bottom rungs of society, as it were. And they employ ways of negotiating with states and power by establishing clientage relationships, cultivating political contacts, by building fictitious kinship relationships, and so on and so forth. So I think we should not underestimate the capabilities of pastoral communities for finding ways of negotiating, even in situations that are not perhaps congenial to them, which is, of course, not to say that they are ideal. They are far from it, because there are ideological changes taking place in people's mental makeup, how they see pastoralists, how they see themselves, so on. So there is a problem there. But I would say, yes, pastoralists will continue to remain, in some ways, highly innovative makers of a cultural and political space for themselves. They have shown themselves to be resilient. If nothing else, they are resilient.
Yeah.
The second question of wastelands, I think this is a very intractable problem. It's an inherited category that the British introduced in India, and we have taken it on lock, stock, and barrel without having critically examined it. Whenever land is needed for anything, whether it is schools, whether it is houses, in cheap houses, or for, say, a solar plant, well, it is the so-called wastelands which go, And there are many examples of fabulous pastoral ranges having been appropriated and disposed of in this manner. What can you do except continue? Last week, I think there has been, if I'm not mistaken, the Andhra Pradesh government has announced a resurvey of land ownership in Andhra Pradesh. So I've been reading the popular press reports in which they're talking about, things like using drones and images so that all conflicts on land, etc., are resolved. But there is no discussion on ownership. The assumption is that private ownership is the only form of land ownership. So it continues. I think as people who are academics and working with pastoralists, we have to continue to open up this category and try and persuade that there are better ways and more meaningful and more constructive ways of looking at what you call wastelands, which are in fact not wastelands at all.
Yeah. Okay, all right. And maybe another important topic, I think, regarding pastoralists is the question of gender, both within pastoralist communities, but also within the people doing research or getting engaged with pastoralists. We've been organizing a workshop last year, and we've seen a lot of young students participating to this workshop. And the fact is, most of the students who participated were women. So it's an interesting change, no?
It's the most wonderful change I can see, because when I began my work, I remember a conference going in, I think it was Tokyo or somewhere, International Anthropology Conference. There was this pastoralism gang meeting there. I think there were some 60, 70 of us. I think there were 2 women researchers in that entire group. So the fact that women have entered the study of pastoralists and pastoral societies, I think fabulous. It's the most wonderful that can happen. Not just because as researchers, there are women, young women working. It is wonderful, fine. But I think it will also affect the nature of the work, the nature of the research that will come out. Because we know not much about pastoral women. We also don't know much about the kind of knowledge that they have about animals, about grasses, about the way in which migrations are organized, the relationship between generations. So I think the entry of women in women researchers will definitely change our understanding and subject knowledge of pastoralism. But there's also another point that I want to sort of touch upon, is that because of our inheritance of, say, economics in some ways, and we have tended to focus upon the productive aspects of pastoralism, marketing and the commodities and the wool and the meat and the milk. We are not as intimately familiar with what you can broadly call reproduction. And I mean not just the animal reproduction, but the system's reproduction. How does pastoralism as a system reproduce itself? So I think at a theoretical level also, a changing gender composition of researchers on pastoralism will have outcomes for the field and the understanding of the subject.
While I was doing research with Rabari people in Gujarat, some families that hosted me for weeks and so on, I was quite surprised by the discourse of people. I came with this romantic idea about pastoralists who are moving, migrating, and they love this way of life and they don't want to leave it. But then when I started discussing with parents who were involved in shepherding in animal husbandry and so on, but almost all were saying, we don't want our kids to go on with the activity. We want to find a better job in cities, in shops, in whatever. And I'm wondering how this idea from the parents saying that our activity or livelihood cannot be going on or is not the good one for our kids has been taking shape, and how this and what would be the consequences of this discourse. I mean, it's like the people integrated the idea that their livelihood is backward and so on. Even so, on one side, people are proud to say, I'm a pastoralist, I have a special link with animals, and this is the duty of our community to take care of animals and so on. But on the other side, they will say, but living like that in the outside is kind of backward and it's not being part of the modern society.
It's a very difficult question to answer honestly. Because why should a pastoralist's son not want to be like you or me or somebody else? It's a perfectly legitimate desire. There is absolutely no question about it. I don't know if I have an answer, and I certainly cannot place myself in a position where I think I can give an answer. But this is the double-edged sword that is not just there in India, it is elsewhere there.
Yep.
The ugly form in which self-esteem becomes restored is what you call revivalism, chauvinism. There are problems with that also. So I think there are questions to which answers will perhaps unfold as we move. I don't have an answer to that question, in all honesty, because I can see both things happening. That there has been very clear offending of sensibilities, of making people feel small, that they don't matter. I remember one incident in which, this is maybe romanticizing, and I apologize if that is what it is. I spent one night with a man who is from a caste called Janglia in Western Rajasthan. They live on the outskirts of fields. They carry an old muzzle loader, and they basically make a living by scaring deer and blue bull from farmers' fields. Now, I spent a day and a night with him, and the man didn't really see himself as inferior to anybody. He looked down upon a lot of people. But it was not just that. He had a knowledge. He told me, sir, I can take you from there where he was, north of somewhere near Govindgarh, which is a place in Rajasthan. I can take you from there to Jaipur without letting you see a single electric pole. Now, that pride in the embedded nature of his knowledge is something that comes only with having lived that life. But there should be cultural conditions that allow that embedded knowledge to be sustainable. Our conditions favor knowledges that are disembedded, that are universalizing knowledges rather than particular kinds of knowledges. And to that extent, the knowledge of the pastoralist is a bit of both. You know, he has knowledge that is abstract about conditions, where to migrate, where to move, the politics of situations, and things like how do you handle court cases, how do you handle but he also has a very embedded kind of knowledge. So this whole thing of self-respect and wanting to be this and that also derive from the way we produce knowledge, the kind of knowledge we value and what we respect. It's a complex answer to a frankly not easy question.
Yeah. I admit it is not an easy question, clearly. If you look at Europe, for example, Western Europe, what we've seen is that there's been a clear decrease in pastoral occupations in the middle of 20th century. But then there is this revival movement for 20 years, something like that. But what we see is that it's new people coming and getting involved in the pastoral occupation instead of people who belong to families who were traditionally pastoralists. It's not the case. Usually they move to different occupations and to the cities and so on. But then you have people from the city who are coming back to the countryside and getting involved into pastoral occupation. But then with very different ways of seeing things, and usually, intellectual, it's usually people who have been doing studies at the university and so on.
That's a kind of experience that I would call, they are there for the experience, as it were. So they may for 4 or 5 years be pastoralists, but they always have their PhDs to go back to or whatever else to go back to. But the bigger point I feel you make is that the notion that some people are pastoralists and only pastoralists is what we need to check. In Rajasthan, I find that there are, for example, Jats. Jats are a dominant, important agrarian class. They are among the important Green Revolution drivers, as it were. Nobody would now, in the popular imagination, see them as pastoralists. But Jats are pastoralists. I think Niladri Bhattacharya's work on Punjab does point this out, that that part of the world was predominantly pastoralists. And the Jats themselves recognize that their origins are in many ways pastoralists. They are shepherds, keepers of cattle and sheep and camel. And it remains an element in their adaptation today, even though it is no longer the dominant one. So people do go in and out of pastoralism, identities change. I think it has to do with larger circumstances and processes to which people are responding to, and in which pastoralism is one element, an important element in their baggage and toolkit of adaptation, as it were.
And we know that this situation that you depict for the case of Rajasthan has been put in place everywhere in India. I mean, the pastoral lands have been change to different use, and we have a lot of land use changes that happen in many areas, no? In relation with the intensification of agriculture or the development of irrigation through tube wells or canals. I'm wondering if there, in this case, there is not an issue about the role of scientists in showing how pastoralists may contribute to the yields of land, to landscapes, and to enrich soils and so on. But it's true that it's quite recent that this ecological contribution of pastoral systems has been actually shown, you know, even so it was known for a long time. The studies focusing on this aspect are quite recent. In Europe, for example, we have now many papers showing how pastoralists and their animals are carrying the seeds of plants, of grasses, and contributing very importantly in spreading the seeds. So in enriching the biodiversity, enriching the soils, and so on. I'm wondering if here there is not, it could be a potential place for action to defend pastoral livelihoods by showing how they contribute to the health of ecosystems and in enriching the soils and nature.
You're touching upon a point that has a lot of implications. If there is something, you know, that we can say pastoralism in crisis, one of the biggest challenges that pastoralists and pastoralism as a system of production face is what I call legitimacy. In the imagination of whether it is development, whether it is popular culture. You romanticize them, that's different. But legitimacy is a kind of space that draws on multiple currents. And one of the currents is what you are calling scientific evidence. Now, here also, you know, they say that the devil can quote scripture for its purpose. So I remember a court case that I contributed in a small way of fighting Godwar Ghumakkad Godwa Berpalak Sangh in Rajasthan, right up to the Supreme Court. Before that in the Madhya Pradesh, where they stopped pastoralists from entering. The Supreme Court of India said that there is no way in which a sheep can be a foreigner in India. The MP Forest Department had described sheep and camels as foreign animals. They had said, so how can they be foreigners if an Indian is not a foreigner? And they struck down the rulings. What did the MP government do? They invoked science. They talked about NPK, they talked about fertilization, they talked about damage to the soil, they talked about the hooves having impact and so on. Half-baked kind of stuff, but broadly around the whole notion of carrying capacity. The idea of carrying capacity has been a very important instrument in sustaining equilibrium arguments, you know, and these arguments have been used in very destructive ways.
Clearly, and everywhere in the world.
Everywhere in the world. They have been used in very clever ways, in very destructive ways, in what I will call is delegitimating pastoralism. Therefore, the kind of work that you are talking about is very important because it tries to show through detailed empirical research the consequences of grazing on biodiversity. Shepherds will tell you, let us not paint the shepherds as an angel. They are not. They're shepherds. They are opportunists. They can take advantage when occasions arise. One should not be romantic about it. But at a system level, I think they are well aware that their presence contributes in positive ways to the making and sustaining of biodiversity. Where animals come and graze, they have certain impacts in controlling certain kinds of plants, in encouraging certain kinds of species. It has an effect on biodiversity, and detailed empirical studies contribute in changing this whole understanding of pastoralists as inherently destructive, exploiting, and damaging of the environment. We don't have such studies in India. North Africa, parts of there have been work of this kind. Europe as well, there has been. But in India, this research has been anecdotal, largely based on descriptions. So if there is recent work, then I'm unaware of it, and that is quite possible that I'm unaware of it. If it is there, I'm very, very happy that it is there. But having said that, science has a very important role in what I would call making a case for pastoralism as a legitimate and rational form of resource and landscape utilization and management. I think it is not sufficient.
There is the political side, no?
There is also the political and
clearly
discussions that also have to be engaged with.
You mean, for example, when we look at some communities like the Dalits and so on, they kind of manage in the public arena to get a coherent discourse and to defend their cause by connecting to different narratives that echoes in the public audience. No, what about the pastoralist communities? It's kind of, there is multiple discourses and maybe not a whole articulated discourse.
Yes, I do believe that pastoralists and those of us who study pastoralists and to some extent are part of a voicing of pastoralist concerns, we have tended to plow a lonely furrow, and there has not been sufficient attempt at engaging with social movements, with political and cultural discourses that are powerful currents in their own right. I remember I was a young man of 27, 28, and there is an organization called People's Union for Civil Liberties, of which I have been a member since that age. I was attending a meeting in Jaipur, and I made a presentation on pastoralist migration, their issues, and because I thought for a young man, it is a really good presentation. I got lynched. On the one hand, there was a leftist of some kind, very radicalized, who tore me apart by saying two things. One is that these are anti-tribal, they are destructive of the tribals, they destroy the environments, and these are dominant groups who are definitely not welcome. They need to be sedentarized. Then there was a Gandhian who lost his cool and called them that they provide the meat industry, they are destructive people, and that they should be sedentarized, they should leave pastoralism, they are a blot on this earth. I'm not saying all Gandhians are like that, but that particular gentleman took that stand. So from both sides, I found that I was not able to connect in any way whatsoever. Things have changed a lot since then. I'm talking of middle 80s, late 80s. I'm talking about then and now. I think there are intellectual and political traditions outside of our domain of the research on pastoralism that we need to tap into, that we need to communicate with and find vocabularies that are overlapping. I think, for example, there is a very famous book by a person, a very well-known author called James Scott, called Seeing Like a State. It is interesting that Scott does not in that book refer to pastoralism. His argument is very relevant for us. He's saying that modernization, industrialization are forms of simplification, and simplification leads to instability and unpredictable chaos. On the other hand, he describes traditional systems, including cities, farms, as complex systems in which is high levels of energy efficiency, long-term stability. Now, this is precisely the kind of language that talks to pastoralists. Pastoralism is complex. A ranch is simple. Industrial husbandry is simple. Pastoralism is in many ways dynamic. It is constantly adapting to changes in circumstances. So, but we have not at all talked with that conversation. Even elsewhere, I find that there is now a widespread understanding that our equilibrium models have tended to limit us from understanding the rationality of production systems. Take, for example, slash and burn cultivation. There is a lot of literature working on that, but we have not been able to find ways of connecting with those. I do believe there are other examples that can be given, and not merely academic examples, even examples that are more based on social movements. So I think an effort should be made to find broader alliances and establish communication.
So, Purnendu, after discussing all these topics and about pastoral people and so on, it's now time to conclude this dialogue. What I think the studying pastoral systems is such a interesting and promising field. Pastoralists are connected with food security, food production. They're also connected with landscapes, biodiversity, and with adapting to changing conditions like climate change and so on. So we should just maybe invite young people to invest in research on pastoral systems. There are so much to do, so much to discover, and so much lessons to learn.
I cannot agree more, Matthieu. In fact, the interesting thing is the very fact that there is a meeting, a conversation like this happening, and that there are conferences and workshops on pastoralism in India is very heartwarming. Because when I started my work, there was really nobody. And I was fortunate in meeting N.S. Jodha, who encouraged me to continue to work on pastoralism. Otherwise, I might have been disheartened. But I think there is a broader transformation that has taken place. For example, evolutionist ideas are no longer current, although they sometimes do tend to influence us. One should not make the mistake of thinking that pastoralism is a solution for everything. But yes, I do believe that in the context of what we call climate uncertainty, the very important need for imagining development not within the framework of growth as exclusively understood, pastoralism can help us understand a lot of things. And maybe I personally don't think pastoralism is a dying way of life, but it has never been all-pervasive. It's probably not going to be all-pervasive, but I do believe it's a very rich, interesting, and a long-term means by which people will continue. So I would encourage people to join us. And thank you very much, Matthieu. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Purnendu. Same.
So thank you, Dr. Purnendu and Dr. Matthieu. Was an amazing, amazing conversation, and I think if I was in classroom, it would have been a crash course on the history of pastoralism. Just everything condensed into one. So nice. There's a lot of questions that have come both on YouTube and on this. So I'm going to quickly start with that. I'm going to call upon.
Shruti, just a
Yes,
sec. Can I just thank everybody on Matthieu and my
definitely,
behalf?
definitely.
It's so,
Yeah.
so nice that all of you could find time to come, and it's just very happy that you all could come. Please go ahead. I shall try to respond to the questions, and so will Matthieu. Both of us will give it a shot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Before we go on to the question answers, I would just like to mention that the Living Lightly Film Festival is on from today to the 24th, and people can go and watch it. The details are also available on the website, so please go ahead. The Living Lightly Film Festival on Pastoralism. Please go ahead and find the details there and join. So I would request the first question is from Shailaja. If Shailaja can unmute herself and ask the question herself.
Sure. Thank you so much. I was fascinated by your point that rivers can be a pastoral imagination. I liked it very much indeed. And I would like to ask both of you, since Matthieu, you work in the Cameroon before you came to India, and Purnendu as well. In particular, this reimagination is fascinating because there's similar work that my colleague Frida did in the northern Kenyan, southern Ethiopian region, where it would appear the pastoralists who only come, once or twice a year, paid for the upkeep of the wells, and the agricultural communities that managed them and got the payment got the free water, but the water was so important for the pastoralists that they were providing the high value inputs. So this changes both production and reproduction that you were talking about, Purnendu. So I would just like some reflections. I'm one of those vilified economists who has found new ways of running her life. So Ashish can tell you more about that another time, but I would be really interested in learning more. Thank you so much.
Matthieu?
Well, it's a very large question. I would say there are so many things about these interactions and the ways pastoralists and other livelihoods get articulated, and mutual dependencies and so on. What I can say is that we have to look at, you are an economist, so we can look at the economical interactions and feedbacks between pastoralists and farmers, but there are so many ways that this interaction can take shape. For example, in Gujarat, I've seen, like, while moving with the Rabari people, they will stay for some days and make their animals graze in some open areas, but in village, they'd cross for a few days. So local pastoralists, local people who have some cows and so on will say, okay, we tolerate these shepherds, but we don't like them to stay so much. But so there is kind of a conflict and tension sometimes. But in fact, if you look at the ecological side, they will contribute by keeping the sheep to enrich the grazing areas, the common pastures in this village that they cross. So it's like very multiple interactions and so on. I mean, it's a short answer, but
That's very helpful, Matthieu, because that means we need to have interaction effects and feedback effects, but do it on a social network mapping, which is a great way forward. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling me about this study. I think you've sent the link. I would be very keen on seeing it. The example you pointed out about, wells being maintained by pastoralists because it was more critical for them in some ways, is something it's quite an interesting observation. The study I did, the links were a little less clear cut, but at an overall level, I believe that pastoralism had a role to play in system maintenance, or rather the existence of pastoralism maintained the entire landscape's integrity. And the breakdown of that particular integrity meant that the river collapsed. One interesting thing that has happened is that I did this study some 20 years ago. Now, I retired about a year and a half ago, and I thought I can again do something in there. And I just recently managed to get a small grant, and I go revisit that area 20 years down the road. And I'll be very happy to keep people who are interested informed about how that goes. Although COVID permitting, I should go to the field and look at that again. In a way, the word reproduction is something that I'm playing around a lot with, because I realize increasingly that there are many aspects of a society's relationships that are not expressed or adequately captured in economic terms, but which are necessarily useful for the other kinds of activity to take place. And developing a vocabulary for that and finding ways of recognizing it, you learn to see things. That itself requires a certain amount of skill. And I believe it's provided me with ways of looking, which I did not have when I was actually doing that study.
That's brilliant. I'd love to learn more as the study goes forward. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Shruti, it would be nice if you read out the questions. As you know, from Rajasthan and from the oral tradition, so
Yes.
reading don't come so strongly to me.
So that's okay. So I'm going to ask the people who've asked the question to ask themselves.
Great.
So it'll be. So the next is Himanshu Upadhyay. So if he's around, if you can unmute.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, Shruti.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Can you hear
How
me?
are you? Yes.
Yes, Himanshu.
So the question goes like this: that there had been efforts when you were working along with Sherin Ratnagar and others at JNU of doing environmental history on pastoralism, looking at pastoral landscapes, and several other work came out from the generation of 90s and thereafter. However, when we look at the canvas of environmental history in India, it's a canvas where you will see forested landscapes studied much more, and the wildlife conservation and the wildlife, the beasts, big cats, written about a lot. Why do you think that a similar attention has not been paid to people's animals?
Has been paid to what?
People's animals.
People's
the
animals.
Livestock. We don't see as much environmental history on livestock. Why did we end up there?
I would first of all say that your own work on the colonial livestock fills some of that gap. But, the tendency, I believe, is to not see animals in the same way that you see trees, plants, grasses. You see them as more in the nature of very obvious artifacts. And to start looking at species and animal populations in the kind of framework that we look at our relationships with what we might call natural resources does not come naturally, as it were. And a result of that has been that production, animal reproduction and production, has been spoken of mainly within the languages and vocabularies of economics, as it were, rather than in the vocabulary of human and social ecology. That's my initial response. And I do believe that this is part of the larger distinction we tend to make between human systems and natural systems. And as these begin to be a conversation, Himanshu, even the conservation conversations today are not what they are 25 years ago. So we are seeing a change, but it's not always that visible. And what you say is true. The animal livestock world has not been as carefully understood by ecologists. perhaps.
Thanks.
If I can add something, I think it's also a matter of dominant discourses, dominant narratives in the history of people. You know, if you look at the ecological history, we've had a lot of historical ecology. We had big changes in the 80s with, for example, the work of Fairhead and Leach about forest degradation and so on in the Sahel area in Africa. There is progress and there are new works that have been done, but the history of landscapes and, for example, in India or anywhere else, including pastoral peoples and domestic animals, is still to be done.
Himanshu, especially on knowledge that pastoralists have about animals, in the last talk that Sushma had, she was giving examples about one very nice story about a person who has 3 generations down, some animals were stolen and then they recognized them. I have seen the same thing happening in Western Rajasthan also. Like some animals were stolen and the guy goes that these are the descendants of my animals that were stolen, and they accept it. Of course, we will call it ethno-veterinary knowledge or something like that. Don't call it science, we'll call it ethnoscience or something like that, which is a very strange way of
and very interesting thing is about the memory of herds, of lineage in herds. You have the beautiful work of Saverio Kratley with the Wodabe, and he shows that you have a memory of the families of cattle who are living with humans on several generations that is kept and transmitted by people.
Also, the animals themselves, Himanshu, in the sense that in Western Rajasthan, it's a very strange way of putting it, but they always say that the Raika herds are the most intelligent. They move fast, they find the best pasture, and they will compare it with other groups which are not. So it seems as if the relationship between animals, human beings, is much more complex than just the kind of passive way we conceive it. But I think we can move from there. Thanks.
May I add a point here that I have seen the pastoralists having the knowledge of even up to the level of breeding. Animals and the pastoralists, the mutuality is a lot. They have sufficiently good knowledge about what animals to breed and what not. And they know how to control that process. That's with them. But my fear was a different one, that with many more people leaving, many more of the pastoralists leaving and the youth not going into that process, and the knowledge not being sort of written, or the modern day knowledge that we have, that one can go and study and become something. But I think just by studying, nobody will be able to become a pastoralist. That's a process, that knowledge which is imbued in them, which you said. How, besides the written knowledge, and with the people leaving that process and not continuation of the knowledge going from generation to generation, do you have some other methods or means by which we can still see that the pastoralism can continue? Professor?
I don't see breed conservation in the same way that you can have seed conservation, like in a seed bank, or these are living strains, and what you rightly said is that this is embodied knowledge. It is not knowledge that is abstract. It is knowledge that comes through practice, becoming if you don't do it, it will probably disappear. But I think there can be a moment when what I call the high valuing or valorizing of the kind of abstract knowledge that we have reaches a point where people begin to see the value of other kinds of knowledges also, which are more embedded in locality, which are more embodied in the form of practice, and which you acquire only by doing. So if pastoralism in some ways becomes practiced by fewer people, that knowledge will also go. I don't believe we can, in any formal way, keep it in a library. It is a living knowledge. It is transferred through institutions which are non-formal. I don't sell my male stock to X group. I don't take the females from Y group or from that region. So there are different tactile understandings of what constitutes something that is appropriate and not appropriate. I wish we could say that there is some formal mechanism we can form, but I believe it's not really likely.
Thank you, Dr. Sadhana. Now we have Ankit, who had asked a question. Ankit, if you would want to unmute yourself.
Good evening, sir. I hope you remember.
Ankit.
Yeah, it was nice to hear from you mentioning Haryana and Jharkhand as well. Sir, I mean, I remember your talk from 2016 Living Lightly conference in Delhi, where you had mentioned that there is a larger acceptance of pastoralists by people. I mean, why should only pastoralists suffer for the sake of others? And I mean, that discussion. But seeing the current scenarios, I mean, this COVID thing and all, I mean, people being suspicious of other people, even, I mean, at one place, sitting, eating together. So how do you see this scenario changing the movements of pastoralists in the coming time? I mean, how do you see this acceptance factor of people playing further?
I'm really not a soothsayer. I can't tell you what will happen in the sense of how the COVID situation will impact on pastoral migrations, which is what your question is. But I believe there is somebody I had talked to recently, and she had been doing some work on pastoralists in Gujarat and had been part of their migrations through the period of COVID. And I believe their perspective was that they would keep moving. The extent to which they have contacts with village people was transient and not necessarily very long duration or close. So yes, there could develop ideas of stigma and distancing or even social hostility. But it could also be that they will find ways in which they strategically shape their interactions and minimize those kinds of. Pastoralists know how to handle ambivalence in the areas where they migrate. It's one of their skills. And I suppose they would have to find ways of handling ambivalence that COVID also generates. But I said, I'm not a soothsayer. We can only wait and see how things work out. But good to hear from you, Ankit. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Ankit. We have Ishita Mohan now. Ishita, can you unmute yourself, Ishita?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm a student of school at the School of Human Ecology in Ambedkar University. And
Ishita, you're not loud enough. Little bit. Can you come closer?
All right. Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying that I'm a student at the School of Human Ecology at Ambedkar University, and I have been reading a lot of case studies and material about how conservation practices create tensions and conflicts with pastoralists. For example, the Operation Save Kilombero in Tanzania, and even in Ladakh with the Sokar Lake, there's tensions with the government and conservationists trying to sedentarize the pastoralists as well as conserving the wolf populations, and that causes livestock, like a lot of harm to the livestock and stuff. So how does one balance these different narratives about what needs to be saved when, and how what needs to be prioritized is probably my question.
I'm sure both of us will have something to say on this. So I would request Matthieu first to go.
Okay, I'll go. It's a very also, I mean, there are many things about conservation and potential conflict of interest between conservation and maintaining livelihoods that have an importance on a even just economical point of view and so on. The thing is that we had the dominating narrative and view on conservation, which was the fortress conservation, the so-called fortress conservation, which was based on the idea that people are destroying nature, and so we need to exclude people from areas that we want to protect. Okay, this led to exclusion of pastoralists as well as so many different people. I mean, if you go to southern Cameroon, you have tropical forest patches, which are so-called protected areas, and they created this area by excluding all the hunter-gatherers, pygmy communities, for example, living there. So, and this view about conservation is still the dominant one, I think, and particularly in India. The conservation areas are built by excluding people and so on. There was a debate last year in Rajasthan about the Kumbhalgarh forest areas, and pastoralists and camel keepers were kind of threatened by being excluded of this area. To my point of view, the one way out of this situation is to try to make change this discourse about the impact of humans on nature. It's to show more and more that people are not destroying nature, but they contribute to maintaining it and so on. This is where I think some studies in ecologies can bring in something, but there are also so many things on the political side. Purnendu, would you like to add something? I don't.
You're muted, sir.
Yes. Ishita, see, throughout my conversation with Matthieu today, I've been trying to build cases that how you can't just study, understand, and hope to contribute to pastoralists and pastoralist lives only by studying pastoralism. So you need to start looking at it in broader context. So conservation is obviously also a discourse. It's not anything less than a discourse, and discourses are usually appropriated by people for their ends. Now, if you look at the social structure of conservation in India, it has a very strong statist element in it. It is also a certain kind of class character, which is not always very progressive. It is, in some ways, quite often, conservationist agendas are driving policies that alienate and marginalize people who have constructed those environments, who are very much part of those environments. So, if we can find ways in which pastoralism and those studying pastoralism also start bringing in the critiques that have emerged elsewhere, whether it is with tribal groups or whether it is with forests or whether it is with some XYZ kind of conversation, and putting a hook that we are not unconnected with all these questions. So you start building alliances that are theoretical as well as political alliances, and at least solidarities, if not alliances. And what you're saying is true, but I believe that it is true only as an observation. There is nothing truth about it. It is definitely the production of a particular kind of discourse which is leading to that situation.
Yes, okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishita. We have Dadas. Dada, if you can unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Dada, can you unmute yourself? We can hear you. Okay. Maybe I'll ask his question.
Okay.
So he mentioned that what would be the fate of urban pastoralists?
I think I asked for this in some ways because we are all trying to build some taxonomies and we are constantly questioning taxonomies. But one has to also try to understand that a category that includes everything also ceases to be useful, and a category that is a taxonomy that is too narrow also needs to be seen as valuable. Now, when you say urban pastoralists, I obviously have some sense about what you're trying to get at. You are talking about, there was this man in Jaipur who had around 80, 70 cows in old Jaipur city. And he would let them out in the day. And those are very cultured animals. So they will go from house to house and be fed and come back. And that was his dairy was to run like that. So it is a mobile form. It is risk distributing. But would you really want to use the word pastoralism? I'm not sure. I remember there was a study done by a Japanese scholar, Dr. Kazunobu Ikea, Dr. Ikea, who was in Bangladesh. He worked with pigs in Dhaka, and he stayed with the pig keepers for about a month and a half, and he moved from dump to dump. And those pigs in Dhaka, mind you, and they migrated and they were surviving and there was a market. So again, it was surviving on waste products or something like that. But I'm not sure if we want to use the word pastoralism for that also. So I think we also get into categories where are definitely some of the properties that we associated with pastoral production systems, namely risk distribution, mobility, high efficiency, low inputs, in capital, not capital intensive, more labor intensive, all these elements come. And definitely we need to have a conversation as to how do we find ways of adequately describing these systems of production. Whether we can call them pastoral, I'm not so readily persuaded. Thank you, Dadas. I hope that at least, I haven't answered, but I've sort of tried to fend it off.
So thank you, Dadas. We all now have Pranav Menon. Pranav, if you can unmute and ask. Pranav? Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, good evening. My question is in the context of the One Gujar community and in to do with how forest land and pastoral communities interact with each other. So what I have, based on some of my experiences on the field, what I have found to gather is that there is a certain notion of how forest land is being categorized by the state today, and that looks at it from a very production point of view. So be it the discourse around conservation or be it a discourse around compensatory afforestation, forest land as such is seen as an area which has to also encourage some form of capital accumulation. And in that context, somewhere, the pastoralists as a community, because they don't associate with land in that regard, they feel alienated. So somewhat what I experienced on the field was that there is, because grassland as a category or as an ecological category also should have the definition of a forest, but today, because forestry is narrowly interpreted, it's enabling, it's sort of showing a shift towards the community wanting to resettle and adopt other forms of informal labor than pursue this livelihood. So I just wanted to know the thoughts of the speakers on whether this is a major challenge which pastoralism as a livelihood sees in the long run. Thank you so much.
Purnendu sir, you're muted.
Matthieu, would you like to go or shall I do? What would you like to say?
What to say? You go and then I will add something.
Okay. So that was Pranav, right, who asked? Oh. Yeah, Pranav. Okay.
Yes.
Pranav, I feel that we need to pull together a lot of the material that people are studying on this forest and pastoralists across the South Asian landscape. You are talking about the One Gujar situation, with Vasant is very knowledgeable and familiar with, which I am not, I cannot comment on it. But we see this issue that if you can't frame your utility, as it were, in production terms, then you just don't exist in the value framework of the government, or even for thinking about ways, thinking about your system of production, its validity. Now, this whole question, the pastoralists have always been involved at some level with markets. They have always produced for markets, whether it's meat, wool, milk, so on, so forth. However, pastoral reproduction is intimately tied up with institutions, norms, values, cultures, which are not expressed as commodity relations. They are expressed as relations of reciprocity, of give and take, of maybe some kind of fictive relationship forming. I think the idea, I remember this gentleman from the Animal Husbandry Department, Rajasthan, long ago, talking that pastoralists produce on no cost or on public cost, as if they were some kind of parasites, and that they should be they should be made to pay for all these things. I believe we need to start documenting, writing about the non-commodity bottom of the iceberg, on which the tip of the commodity iceberg is resting. And there is definitely an important tip of the commoditized iceberg that pastoralists are on, but they don't seem to understand that that would not be possible without all those relationships, including those on forests. Specifically in forests, I think I see Sajal here also in Maharashtra. He's been doing some work on looking at similar things. In Rajasthan, in I think Siriska, there is somebody interested in these questions. You are interested. In the South, there are cases. Maybe we should start pulling together and hold a little workshop and just start looking at pastoralists and forests as a very interesting case to pursue some more research and at least start conversations on. I would be delighted. Matthieu.
Yeah. I will add also something about the categories that are used to talk about forest, grasslands, and so on. There is also here the history of the category of forest as it is used in India. There has been some work by some ecologists from Bangalore showing that many of the areas that are classified as forests nowadays are in fact savannas. So here, I think there is also something to dig in and to look at. You know, the narrative about degradation or the bad impact of people on forest is also rooted in this, in the classes that are used to talk about the landscape. So if we consider that one area was a forest and we look at it now and we see it is a savanna, we only can say that, oh, there was degradation because of overgrazing or whatever, of bad human impacts. But in fact, it seems that in many places it was a savanna and it remained a savanna. Um, just to talk about the ecological side of the thing.
Thanks, Matthew. We have Sajal, who is also asked a question. Sajal, you would like to unmute and ask your question?
Dadas also got left out. Maybe Dadas also can be there.
Dadas I had asked, which was the urban pastoralist.
Okay, that was Dadas. Okay.
Yes. Sajal?
Sajal, yeah.
Oh, I can. Yes.
Yes. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
So my question is, can we call Banjaras as a pastoralist because their history is about trading, and recently they, when they lost their, what we can say, their job or their services, they came into breeding and keeping large herds. So can we classify them as a pastoralist, or like last time Sushma Ben was also telling that new communities who are practicing extensive animal keeping, like we have Goaris also in this area. So I would like to know so Kavoori sir's comment, also Matthew's comments on this.
Sajal, people come into pastoralism and they move out of pastoralism, as I said. You know, if you look at the Banjara history, I think a historian may be a better person really to answer that question. They have always kept animals, but in the past they have been more in terms of different kinds of trades. And I don't know in your part of the world what the Banjara patterns of movement, what kinds of animals they keep, whether it's in an open range grazing system. But I don't want to put too tight a definition, you know. So they could be practicing certain forms of pastoralism. And, you know, like in Western Rajasthan, there is a group called Meghwal. It's a Dalit group, and they would be keeping animals even earlier on. But when I last went to field, I remember you would find that they had started keeping larger herds also. That is to say, they were entering. So to some extent, we need to be careful of saying that this is the boundary and only these people are pastoralists, those are not pastoralists. So it could well be that they are forming, they are adapting, and they are practicing certain kinds of production that you can call pastoral. And the important point is the theoretical one, that what is it that allows people to keep animals sustainably in a particular landscape, in the context of a particular community? How do they negotiate that community? What are the systems of marketing and so on? So whether we want to give the label of pastoralism or not, we can definitely point out that this kind of practice that they have takes a lot of its rationality from what pastoralists have historically been employing. Maybe Matthieu has something to add, please.
Yeah, yeah. It's always difficult to say, okay, these people are pastoralists and these are not. You have two sides, I would say. One is the identity, how people self-identify themselves. Will they say we are pastoralists because we have this history of keeping animals or this special connection with one species? And the other side is the productive activity, the livelihood they have. You have so many changes possible of people getting sedentary, taking animals for some time and moving with the animals and so on. So I wouldn't stick to the question as to whether, shall we say, these people are pastoralists or not. It's much more complex, and yeah. Otherwise, one way to talk about pastoralists is to say it's people who are grazing animals on natural pastures. But with this, I mean, you can, frontiers are always fluctuating.
You could also look at the form in which labor is employed. You could get into the peasants discussion about what are peasants, what are not peasants, and so on. So you can look at the form in which labor is employed. Do they bring in hired labor? Do they do it themselves? What is the kind of family? So maybe we can find ways of looking at that group in terms of its strategy. And understanding the strategy is perhaps more important than giving it a label.
Thank you, Dr. Matthieu and Dr. Purnendu. I think it's way past how much we were going to talk. I mean, we were going to end at 6 o'clock, but it's already 6:30. So I think we're going to call it, we can close this session. I apologize for those who have asked questions and we are unable to take it, because this conversation is so wonderful in itself that it can go all night, and Matthieu, for you, the entire day. So I would request both of you, if you would like to share your email ID and people can get in touch with you and continue these conversations. Thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing these conversations. And it was really, really wonderful to have you on board for this session. And I would also like to thank the participants who have stayed for 2 hours listening to all of this. And also, I would like this opportunity to thank the team members, Meenal, Ria, Vasant, Sushma, who've been very, very pivotal in putting these and curating these conversations. So thank you all. I hope you have a great evening, and we will have more of these conversations in the future as part of Pastoral Dialogues. All of these are also being recorded and being put up on YouTube. So if anyone who has missed or who joined late or had to leave early, you can always go to the Kalpavriksh YouTube channel and search for Pastoral Dialogues, and you can catch up on whatever the conversations has happened. So thank you very much.
One second, Shruti. They will also be seen on the Indian Commoner.
Indian Commoner, yes.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that. So
yes, we were also, there was one suggestion that's come of a lot of rich conversations that's happening parallelly over the chat, and we will try and see if that can be collated somewhere and put, and we will keep everyone informed. So thank you. Thank you, Dr. Purnendu. Thank you, Dr. Matthieu. It was lovely having you here.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Shruti.
everybody. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. A lot of very interesting remarks also, and references and so on. It's great.
Yes.